Right, thanks everybody for coming. Really pleased to see everybody here. I'm particularly pleased to welcome David to Loughborough. He's been visiting us in the Centre for Mathematical Cognition for the last 3 weeks, maybe. Is that right? So a bit of background. I did my research for this introduction. You'll be pleased to know. David did his PhD at Indiana University with Robert Goldstone, and interestingly, for those of us who have discussed this before, has a PhD in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So we can ask David if there's a difference between those two things later. Then did a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon with Bob Ziegler, and is now running his own lab at Florida State University. And it's really cool to have David here because he's one of the few people in the world who does stuff at the boundaries of the psychology of reasoning and mathematical cognition. And that indeed is what he is going to talk about today. So over to David.
So thanks very much for that introduction. Yeah, as Matthew just mentioned, my work for the first several years of my postgraduate time was focused on math cognition, and I continued that work as I came to my faculty position at Florida State. But in the past few years, I've gotten more interested in reasoning specifically, and so that's what I'd like to talk about today. I am going to focus on a particular kind of reasoning called conditional reasoning. So I want to first just explain what that is and motivate the reason for being interested in this kind of reasoning. So conditional reasoning refers to reasoning involving conditionals or if-then statements. And as I want to just illustrate with a few examples, these kinds of statements are used very widely to represent knowledge in various domains, such as everyday life, like if you snooze, you lose; in literature, like if music be the food of love, play on; in law, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you; in science, if water is chilled to 0 degrees, it will freeze. And besides just using such statements to represent knowledge, we also use them to construct arguments. So an example is shown at the bottom here. In general form, we often make arguments of the form if P then Q, P therefore Q. And so these considerations, the use of conditionals to represent knowledge and to construct arguments, have motivated a pretty large body of research on conditionals in the psychology of reasoning. Sorry, this clicker is a little lagging a little, so I'm going to rely on the mouse from here on. But given my background in math cognition, most of my work has focused on applying the theories that come from the psychology of reasoning in general to math in particular. And just as in other domains, conditionals play a central role in mathematics, where they, by the way, when I practiced, I tried to train myself to say maths instead of math, but I failed to do so. So I'm probably going to keep saying math throughout. I hope you'll forgive me for that. But as I want to illustrate with a few more examples, conditionals play a very central role in math as well. They're used to express a variety of different kinds of mathematical knowledge, including definitions, like a number is even if it's divisible by 2. Axioms, like if A equals B, then B equals A. Theorems, like if M and N are multiples of the same number, then their sum is also a multiple of that number. And conjectures, like if N is greater than 1 and 2 to the nth power minus 2 is divisible by N, then N is prime. That one is a bit of a mouthful. It's actually one of the simpler examples I could find. You can test it for a few cases if you care to do so. So if we consider N equals 2, 2 to the second power is 4, minus 2 is 2, which is divisible by 2, and 2 is prime, so it's true for 2. You can consider 3, 2 to the third power is 8, minus 2 is 6. 6 is divisible by 3, and 3 is prime. If you go to 4, you probably are already tired of it, but just so we get one case that is not prime, 4 is our first non-prime number, so 2 to the fourth is 16, minus 2 is 14, which is not divisible by 4. If you keep going, you'll find that it checks out for the first few hundred numbers. But I'm calling it conjecture in contrast to the third item because you can't immediately see a way to prove that it's true for all numbers, although it does seem to be true for quite a few numbers at least. All right, so a few questions that come up in my mind when considering how to apply the psychology of reasoning in general to the case of math in particular are: first, how is conditional reasoning in this domain similar to or different from the way it works in other domains? How well can general theories of conditional reasoning that have been developed for everyday content or sometimes scientific content, how well can those theories explain the way that it works in math? And what can we learn about conditional reasoning in general by examining how it works in math? So those are the questions that motivate my research in the last few years that I want to present today. And I want to organize my discussion around two big questions relating to conditional reasoning. First is a question of interpretation, which is, what does it mean for a conditional statement to be true? And the second is a question of inference, which is, how do we evaluate arguments or inferences that involve conditional statements? So let me start with the first of those 2 points. The psychology of reasoning, when talking about the meaning of conditional statements, has often used classical logic as a reference point. And by classical logic, I mean the theory of logic that has been developed in philosophy. So I want to just first say, what is the normative standard according to philosophers for what conditionals mean in a classical logic framework? And to explain that, I need to refer to a truth table. So if we're talking about a conditional statement, if P, then Q, a truth table is the table you see here, which represents all of the possible combinations of P being true or false and Q being true or false. And there are 4 such combinations. And the values in the 4 cells tell us in each of these 4 cases whether the conditional is considered true in that case. So if P and Q are both true, we consider if P then Q to be true. And if P is false, no matter what is the case for Q, we consider if P then Q to be true. There's only one instance where we say if P then Q is false, and that is the case where P is true and Q is false. In that case, we say if P then Q is also false. So to say if P then Q means you're asserting that one of the 3 cases marked true is the case. And if we say if P then Q is true, we're correct unless P is true and Q is false. That's the philosophical theory. But you notice that this theory is treating P and Q as sort of propositions that are simply true or false. And usually we're not interested in statements like that. We're interested, at least in math, in making generalizations that apply across a large number of cases, usually an infinite number of cases. Such conditionals we might call general conditionals. And so the question arises, like, how do we extend that theory that I just described to the case of general conditionals? What do they mean? Let me just remind you of 2 examples of general conditionals that I've already shown. One from science: if water is chilled to 0 degrees, it will freeze. One from math: if 2 to the n minus 2 is divisible by n, then n is prime. These both make assertions about an infinite set. In the first case, we're not talking about some particular case of water. We're talking about all water everywhere. In the second case, we're talking about all numbers n. So what would you say if you found that there were exceptions to these statements? For example, that water does not freeze at 0 degrees if it's under very high pressure, or that 341 is a number such that 2 to the power of it minus 2 is divisible by that number, even though that number itself is not prime. These both constitute exceptions, but you'll notice that these exceptions are in both cases quite rare, right? So you have to sort of know a lot about science, or you have to encounter some very extreme conditions in your life in order to see a case where water doesn't freeze at 0 degrees. And similarly, you have to go through quite a few numbers before you find one that violates that statement on the right. So the question arises, well, do these very rare exceptions falsify the general rule? Or are we willing to say the general rule is still basically true, despite the fact that there are very rare exceptions to it? Those are the questions that I've just said. Well, what I want to suggest is that the answers to these questions may be different depending on whether we're talking about math or something other than math. And I want to just lay out some theoretical machinery to analyze that question more precisely. And to do so, I just want to refer to 2 general theories of conditional reasoning from psychology, which are the mental models theory and the so-called new paradigm. These 2 theories suggest different interpretations or different truth conditions for general conditionals, like the ones that I just showed. The mental models theory implies an interpretation that we might call deterministic, which is that when you say if P then Q as a general statement about many cases, what you mean is it's impossible for P to be true and Q to be false at the same time, that condition cannot be. And if that is what you mean, then a single exception shows you to be wrong, right? Because a single exception shows that it is possible. It's not impossible. So if this is what you mean, a deterministic meaning, then a single exception should be considered to falsify a general rule. The new paradigm, on the other hand, takes what you could call a probabilistic interpretation, where if P then Q doesn't mean it's impossible, but only that it's improbable that P is true and Q is false. So when you assert if P then Q, you don't mean that in literally every single case where P is true, Q is false. You just mean most of the time that that is so. And if that is what you mean, then finding a single exception isn't really a problem for you. It would only be a problem if exceptions were common, but if they are rare, they would not falsify the statement. Now, I've already sort of suggested that the answer to my question about how general conditionals are interpreted, whether it is deterministic or probabilistic, might differ between math and other domains. There is some prior research just showing in general that the way general conditionals are interpreted varies by context. And applying that to math in particular, I'd like to think of this line from Roger Bacon, some, I guess, 800 years ago now, where he says, in mathematics alone is there certainty without doubt, suggesting that there's a unique association between math among all domains of study and certainty. This, by the way, if you ever play Civilization 4, this quotation appears when you discover the technology of mathematics. If Bacon is right about this unique association between math and certainty, we might expect that general conditionals would be interpreted more deterministically in math than they are in other domains, including even rigorous domains like science. And that led me to make two empirical predictions, which are shown here. First, compared to scientific conditionals, we expect that mathematical conditionals are more likely to be considered falsified by rare exceptions. And second, compared to scientific conditionals, mathematical conditionals are more likely to be thought to imply that rare exceptions don't exist. So these are predictions we can test empirically, and I want to show you findings from two studies that did so. These studies use two different tasks. I'll show results from the first task, which is first, and that's the set-based truth task. What I did in this task was to present individuals with these kind of concocted scenarios where they were supposed to imagine imaginary categories in math and science. And we're seeing on the left the case for math. They're told to imagine that a mathematician discovered a type of numbers called spatial numbers, which come in three varieties: sun numbers, moon numbers, and star numbers. And they are then given some statistics about these numbers, which are used to test hypotheses. So the hypotheses here are the conditional statements that I'm interested in. This is text from one trial. So they're being told in this trial that the mathematician hypothesizes if a number is a sun number, then the number is prime. That's the general conditional whose interpretation we're trying to investigate. And then we're given some statistics that are said to come from an infallible computer program that tell us what percent of sun numbers actually are prime and what percent are not. So this second percentage here, this is the rate of exceptions, which is manipulated experimentally to range from 0 to 1 to 10 to 50 to 90. And the question is, in each of those cases, suppose the true rate of exceptions is, for example, 1%. Would you judge the hypothesis now to be true or false? Now, scientists often face a very similar question, and that's embodied in the other version, the science version of the task that's shown on the right here, where participants are asked to imagine that a scientist has discovered a type of fruit called Wumpa fruit that appears in Crash Bandicoot if you've ever played that. And there are three types of Wumpa fruit, which are spiky, rough, and squishy. The scientist makes hypotheses about the Wumpa fruit, such as if a Wumpa fruit is spiky, then it has green seeds, and an infallible DNA analysis, analogous to the infallible computer program, then tells you the true rate of spiky Wumpas that do or do not have green seeds. And you're then asked to judge whether the hypothesis is true or false in light of those data. All right, so before I show you the results, the purpose for using these fictional categories is because I want to be able to tell participants how many exceptions there are. If I were to use real categories, participants would come in with their own knowledge or beliefs about the existence or non-existence of exceptions, and that would defeat the experimental manipulation. So we'd like to see if the responses are different between math and science, but we really only predict a difference for the cases where exceptions exist but are rare. In the cases where the rate of exceptions is 0%, we don't expect any difference between math and science. You should judge a conditional to be true in either case if there are no exceptions to it. And we also expect no difference in the case where exceptions are common, 50% or 90%. In both cases, you should say a conditional is false. The prediction was, in the case of rare exceptions, math should be interpreted more deterministically than science. So I'm going to show you the results only for the rare exception cases, which are 1% and 10%. And we're going to look at the percentage of participants who said the conditional is false in those cases separately for math and science. And here are the results. So these are results from two studies, one at Florida State University, one with university students recruited through Prolific. I'm not going to really discriminate between them because the results are basically the same. So just focusing on the chart on the left, we can see blue bars are math, green bars are science, and the rate of false responses indicating that rare exceptions falsify the conditional is higher for math than for science, both for 1% and 10% exceptions, in line with the prediction. So that was one of two tasks that I used to test the hypothesis. The other one was the so-called possibility of exceptions task, which is shown here. This kind of reverses the sequence of reasoning compared to the previous task. In the previous case, we were given a hypothesis and asked to test it, given certain data that you're supposed to assume are true. In this case, you're supposed to assume that the conditional, the hypothesis, is true, and to ask whether certain data would be possible in that case. So suppose it's true that if a number is a sun number, then the number is prime. Is it possible that 1% of sun numbers are not prime? Or suppose it's true that if a wampa is spiky, then it has green seeds. Is it possible that 1% of spiky wampas don't have green seeds? And so the question is, does the rate of saying no, it's not possible, differ between math and science for the rare exceptions cases? And here are the results where you see, again, that the rates of sort of no responses are higher for math than science for the rare exceptions cases in both studies, with the one exception of the 10% case for the first study where that effect did not appear. So just to summarize the key results from this part of the work, I find these results broadly consistent with Bacon's claim that certainty resides in math alone, and that can therefore, as we might expect, conditionals are interpreted more deterministically in math than in science. We might wonder, where does this come from? Like, if people walk around most of the time thinking of conditionals as expressing a probabilistic relationship and not a deterministic one, what mechanism would make them think differently in math? Well, I propose two possible explanations. These are really just speculative because I haven't tested them, but one is pragmatic, that students in the math classroom sort of know what their teachers mean when they say, if two numbers are even, their sum is even, or something like that. And they know what their textbook designer means when they write statements like that. So their interpretations of conditionals in math are guided by their understanding of the intentions of their instructors, essentially. The other possibility is epistemic. And the idea here is that we know where knowledge comes from, or we know something about where it comes from in different domains, and that there is a unique source of knowledge in math that isn't present in any other domain, and that is proof. In math alone, we can prove deductively that statements are true. We don't have to infer it from empirical evidence. In fact, empirical evidence doesn't really mean anything in math. You have to prove statements. And to the extent that individuals know this and know that deductive proof can confer absolute certainty, or if they think that that's so, they might interpret mathematical statements to be more certain because of that source of knowledge. Of course, that could be true even if the individuals themselves can't write proofs. They just need to know that proofs exist. All right, so that's what I'd like to say about the first line of work on the question of interpretation, and I'll turn now to the second line that has to do with inference or evaluating conditional arguments. To do this, I want to just have a reference point that's a little concrete. So I'd like to present you a few actual conditional arguments. I apologize for any of you who attended my workshop on computational modeling, where I think I used the same examples, so it'll be a little repetitive for you. But for the rest of you who didn't, I'm going to test you now and see if you can evaluate these arguments correctly. So please pay attention. You're going to have to tell me whether each argument is valid or not. This is the first argument. If m and n are both even, then m plus n is even. Suppose m and n are both even, does it follow that m plus n is even? Now, I just used the word valid a moment ago, and I didn't explain what it means, but what it means is captured in this question. Valid means the conclusion follows from the premises. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So is that so in the case of this argument?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. It's pretty much the most straightforward argument you could imagine, like if this, then that, this, therefore that. Like, that's pretty much what if then means. Okay, the second one is a little more tricky. If m and n are both even, then m plus n is even. Suppose m plus n is not even. Does it follow that m and n are not both even?
Yes.
Yes, okay, that one is, I think, more tricky, but it is still valid. If it's not obvious to you why it's valid, you can kind of think counterfactually. Suppose it were not the case that m and n are not both even. In other words, suppose m and n were both even. Well, then m plus n would be even. But I told you that it's not. So it's not. I hope that made sense. But that's pretty much the only way to explain it. I could say it like 3 times to solidify it, but I'll spare you that. Here's a third case. If m and n are both even, then m plus n is even. Suppose m plus n is even. Does it follow that m and n are both even?
No.
Okay, I saw some nods and some no's. The correct answer here is no. It does not follow. It could be that m and n are both odd. M and n could be, for example, 3 and 1. In that case, m plus n would be 4, which is even though m and n are not both even. And finally, if m and n are both even, then m plus n is even. Suppose m and n are not both even. Does it follow that m plus n is not even? Okay, no, the reason is the same. So you can imagine that m and n are 3 and 1, which are not both even, but in that case, m plus n is even. It's not even, so that does not follow. All right, so we have here 4 examples of conditional inferences. The question I want to investigate in my research is, what are the psychological processes that are involved when people evaluate these arguments and try to determine which of them are valid and which are not? One way you could do that is based on the logical form of the arguments. And when I say logical form, what I mean is you pretty much look only at the logical words like if and then and therefore and follow, but you ignore the content of the arguments. And so if we do that, if we just pay attention only to the logic words and ignore the content, we can see that these arguments take the 4 forms that are shown here. The first is called modus ponens, or MP for short, and it has the form if P then Q, P therefore Q. That's always valid. It doesn't matter what P and Q are. The second is modus tollens. It takes the form if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. It is also always valid, again, no matter what P and Q are. And the last 2 are called affirmation of the consequent and denial of the antecedent. The terms antecedent and consequent refer to P and Q. So if P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. Affirmation of the consequent means I tell you that Q is true, and you conclude P. Denial of the antecedent means I tell you that the antecedent P is not true, and you conclude that Q is not true. And in general, those 2 argument forms are not valid. Unless you have additional information about P and Q that isn't shown here, the conclusions don't follow for the reasons that I have already described. So if you've taken a course in logic, or if you're just a logically minded kind of person, you could evaluate these arguments in this way by attending to their logical form and ignoring the content. But we know from decades of research in cognitive psychology that most people, most of the time, don't do that. Even though they could, even though they would get all the right answers if they did, but that's not what they do. Instead, what people do is that they rely in part on knowledge about the content of the inferences, which I actually did when I was telling you why AC and DA were not valid. I gave you the example of 3 and 1, which is my knowledge about the content. So just to bring that point home, let's just compare these 2 conditional inferences. If water is chilled to 0 degrees, it will freeze. Water is chilled to 0 degrees, therefore it will freeze. For most people, I think that would be a pretty compelling argument. Maybe not for you, because I've already sort of highlighted that water does not always freeze at 0, but most people are not consistently aware of that fact, and therefore would tend to accept this argument, but might well reject this one if a cup is dropped, it will break. A cup is dropped, therefore it will break. I imagine you might immediately think, what if the cup is made of metal? What if you only dropped it from an inch in the air? It might not break. So even though these two arguments have the exact same logical form, people would be, in general, more inclined to accept the first than the second. And the reason for that is their knowledge about the content. So I said decades of research. So why is this still sort of a live issue? Why is it worth studying? Well, I think the reason is it hasn't really been investigated in the area of math that much. And in math, we might expect that things might be different. I've sort of already shown you a set of studies that show that math is different. It's associated with certainty to a level that isn't present even in science. And moreover, in math, the standard of formal logic is highly valued. It's a normative standard in math. It's explicitly taught, especially in higher levels of math. And so the possibility that people would evaluate arguments based on their logical form seems more plausible in math than in any other domain. So we might ask, do people still rely on their knowledge of the content when doing conditional reasoning in math the way they do in other domains? Or is math different in this case, just as it was in the case of interpretation that I showed earlier? So I want to show you a series of studies that tried to answer this question. I'll go through a couple of them very quickly, and then the others in more detail. But I first just want to show you the task that I used, because this one is shared across all the studies that I'll show, to assess conditional reasoning in the domain of math. I used conditionals involving algebra content, like the one I showed before. If m and n are both even, then m plus n is even. And a single trial of my conditional inference task with algebra content would look like this. I would present a conditional statement and tell participants to assume it's true. They were all true, by the way. And I would give them an additional premise, such as m plus n is even. And then I would ask them what follows, if anything. So in the case of the modus ponens and modus tollens forms, one of these first two choices would be a conclusion that does validly follow. In the case of AC and DA, the other two argument forms, the correct response here would be neither. So I'm interested in the role of knowledge of algebra in determining whether people get the right answers on questions like this. So a first study that I conducted in this line, I just measured algebra knowledge using an algebra word problem task. And I measured conditional inference with algebra using this task shown on the right. And I measured some other control things, in particular, general conditional inference skills, which used a similar conditional inference task, but with everyday content instead of math content. And the central finding was that individual differences in accuracy on the algebra knowledge task were predictive of accuracy on this algebra conditional inference task, even when controlling for accuracy on the general conditional inference task. So that suggests it's at least preliminary evidence for some role of content-specific knowledge in driving performance on the inference task, apart from general logical reasoning abilities. Of course, it doesn't tell us what kind of knowledge, because an algebra word problem task relies on all kinds of knowledge about algebra. And I was interested in trying to be more precise about what is knowledge here, what is exactly the form of knowledge that's being used. So to answer that question, I conducted a second study in which I asked individuals to think out loud while doing the task on the right here. And I had a hypothesis that was just based on some anecdotal observations that individuals would often refer to examples, like I used the example of 3 and 1 earlier. So I coded the transcripts of their think aloud protocols in this study to indicate whether or not they referred to examples when reasoning about the validity of these inferences. And what I found was that differences between individuals in how often they referred to examples predicted their accuracy on the conditional inference task, even when controlling for not only general conditional inference skill, but also for general algebra knowledge. So this suggests that your knowledge of examples in particular is kind of the active ingredient of algebra knowledge that is being used to support inference performance. And I want to just give some examples of the kinds of things that people said that were coded as displaying use of examples or not. So these are two transcripts. Sorry, these are two transcripts that I'll show you that both come from the same item. If m and n are both even, then m plus n is even, m plus n is even. If these two statements are true, which of the following must be true, followed by those answer choices that I showed you earlier. So here's a transcript from a participant who was not coded as referring to examples. This participant says, so again, we have the first part, we have just half of the first statements, so nothing's changed. So we should assume that the second part of the statement would be the same. So in this case, they would be even. Not correct. Also does not refer to any examples. And here is a transcript from a different participant doing the same trial who does refer to examples right out of the gate. The participant says, well, 2 and 4 is 6, which is even, and they're both even. So m plus n is even in this case, they mean. But if they're both odd, like 3 plus 1, that's 4, which is an even number. So I think it can be both, which makes it neither. I love statements like that because you can't understand them without the context, but hopefully with the context, it's easy to understand. I think it can be both means that m and n could both be even and might also not both be even. Those are both possible, and therefore neither is the correct answer to the question. So the use of examples enables this participant to get it right. And as the analyses that I summarized earlier showed, that was a general phenomenon and not restricted to these two cases. But relying on think aloud protocols to assess the use of knowledge of examples is maybe not the best approach because participants were not really instructed to use examples, so we're not really measuring how well they can do that. We're just measuring whether they do it spontaneously and whether they verbalize the examples that they're using. So some individuals may have been thinking about examples even though they didn't say so out loud. We'd like to have a way of measuring example knowledge that is sort of consistent across participants and then use that to examine more systematically whether such knowledge is related to inference. So I developed this task, the example generation task, to measure individual differences in participants' knowledge of examples relevant to the mathematical conditionals that I showed. In each trial of this task, participants would be presented with descriptions of the 4 possibilities that are in the truth table for a single conditional. So you might recall that truth table includes 4 cells, with each cell representing one of the combinations of P being true or false and Q being true or false. And the 4 statements here describe those 4 combinations. Notice, though, that the conditional itself is not shown here. So if you just look at this, you have no reason to think it has anything to do with conditionals or conditional reasoning. It just has to do with these 4 possibilities. And the task is to come up with numbers that make each of these descriptions true. Or if there are no such numbers, you can write none. Okay, so sorry, the conditionals here just schematically, they represent the cases where P is true and Q is true, P is true and Q is false, P is false and Q is true, or P and Q are both false. That's not shown to participants, that's just for your information. And so here would be an example of a way a perfect participant could have responded on this trial. They could say, okay, m and n are both even and m plus n is even. Well, it could be that m is 4 and n is 2. M and n are both even and m plus n is not even. Well, there are no such numbers, so you should write none if you're responding correctly. M and n are not both even and m plus n is even. You could write, for example, 3 and 5. And m and n are not both even and m plus n is not even. You could write 3 and 4. Okay, so that would be an example of a correct response on this, this task. The question was, would differences in accuracy on this task predict accuracy on the inference task? And the answer is yes. So here are the analyses that tested that question. These are results of 2 linear regression models. The dependent variable in both cases is accuracy on the algebra conditional inference task. And the first model shown on the left has 2 predictors, which are first a measure of general conditional inference skill, not involving math, it's involving everyday content. And the second is a measure of general algebra knowledge, which is the same word problem task that I mentioned earlier. And we can see that those are each unique predictors of conditional inference accuracy with math content. But in the second model, I add an additional predictor, which is accuracy on the example generation task. And that is an even stronger predictor than either of the other two, and in fact knocks out the effect of algebra knowledge. So again, consistent with the idea that it's knowledge of examples that is the specific active ingredient that matters when it comes to conditional reasoning. Now, what we're really interested in, I guess, is causal effects. We sort of, not as often as I would like, find actual evidence for causal effects, but I would like to say that this effect of example knowledge on conditional inference is indeed a causal effect. And to do so, I need some way to manipulate experimentally example knowledge. So that's what I tried to do in the last study in this line that I'll show you. But I want to just give a little background for how I manipulated example knowledge. And the manipulation is kind of inspired by an analysis of the errors that people committed on the example generation task. My reasoning was, if you look at what people are doing wrong in the assessment of example knowledge, then you know what you have to fix when you want to manipulate example knowledge. So the errors on this example generation task fell into two categories, which I call generation failure and categorization error. Generation failure means in any of the three columns where there are valid answers, you write none. Okay, so you claim that there are no answers in a case where there actually are valid answers. That's a generation failure. You can't come up with an example even though true examples exist. A categorization error means that you put down an example that doesn't actually fit the description that it's supposed to fit. So you're supposed to come up with numbers that are, for example, both even and have an even sum, but you come up with numbers that are not both even or that do not both have an even sum. And initially, I actually did not think this second category of error would exist because honestly, all these statements just involve basic algebra. We're dealing with university students who presumably have competence with basic algebra. So I didn't expect to see people finding, making incorrect claims about which of the truth table cells a given example would fall into. But in fact, that was a substantial proportion of the errors that I observed. Here are some instances of those kinds of errors. These are actual responses generated by my participants. So for instance, when given the prompt, m and n are both even and m plus n is not even, some participants responded m equals 0, n equals 0. This response seems to kind of reflect confusion about whether 0 is an even number or not. I do know that a lot of undergraduates are not sure whether 0 is even. It is, by the way, just in case. But notice that no matter what you think about whether 0 or even, this response doesn't make sense, right? If you think 0 is even, then you can say m equals 0, n equals 0 satisfies m and n are both even, but it doesn't satisfy m plus n is not even because m plus n is also 0. On the other hand, if you think it's not 0, then the first clause is not satisfied. The other responses here have a similar character. So in the fourth experiment here, I set out to try to correct both of these errors, the generation failure and categorization error, by giving participants for each conditional several examples correctly classified of each of the possibilities that exist. That's to fix the generation failure problem. And also making sure that those examples are all properly classified, and that is to fix the categorization error problem. So the task is shown here. In each trial of the task, participants would be shown the same 4 descriptions of possibilities that appear in the example generation task earlier. But in this case, instead of generating the examples, they're given a set of examples that they're asked to classify by dragging them into the appropriate box. And these examples always consist of 2 for each of the 3 true possibilities, which are this one, and this one. Obviously, there's no examples for the other one because those don't exist. So you would, in this case, drag these first 2 here, drag these 2 here, drag these 2 here. These, in fact, were randomized in terms of their order. But what if you did something wrong? Well, then the ones that you did wrong would be highlighted, and you would have to correct those incorrect classifications before you could proceed. So at the end of one trial here, participants would be guaranteed to have seen 6 correctly classified examples, including some for each of the 3 possibilities that exist, and they would also see an empty box for the one that doesn't exist. So I want to show you the results from this study. What I'm the way in which I'll show that is to show percentage endorsement rates for each of the 4 inference forms, separately for trained and untrained conditionals. Now, I want to be clear that the trained versus untrained here is a within participant manipulation. So each participant received that training that I just described for half of the conditionals in my set before doing the inference task and did not receive it for the other half. And which conditionals were trained and which were untrained was randomized between participants.
Sorry,
Yes.
what training exactly is that?
So again, the training is just this task. You would, if for a trained conditional before doing the inference task for that conditional, you do this task
Oh, I see.
for the
Yeah.
same conditional. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, so here are the results. What I'm showing you is trained in green, untrained in blue. These are endorsement rates for the four inference forms. Now, modus ponens and modus tollens, I hope you'll remember, are both valid. So we want people to endorse those inferences. Modus ponens is generally at ceiling, and it is in this case. So there's no effective training there, but there is an effect for modus tollens such that trained conditionals, for trained conditionals, modus tollens is endorsed at a higher rate. And then for AC and DA, recall that those are invalid inference forms, so a correct response is to not endorse. And we can see that indeed, for trained compared to untrained conditionals, those forms are endorsed less, which is what we want again. So these findings do demonstrate a causal effect of example knowledge on conditional inference. Now, the last point I want to address in my remaining time is, what about individuals who are actually pretty good at math? I don't think that descriptor applies necessarily to the average psychology pool undergraduate at my university. They are psychology majors and not math majors. What if we look at math majors? So we have seen that for these psychology majors, the way that they reason about conditional arguments in math is pretty similar to the way that they reason about conditional arguments everywhere else. That is, they rely on knowledge and not just logical form. But individuals who are quite good at math, we might expect the picture to be different for them. Like even if these so-called ordinary adults rely on knowledge and not just logic, those who are highly skilled in math might rely more on logic. I can think of at least two reasons why that might be so. One having to do with math aptitude, that kind of aptitude might just be associated at the level of individual differences with more attention to logical form, and consequently, relatively speaking, less reliance on content knowledge for tasks that appear to be logic problems, which is what these are. On the other hand, there may also be an effect of training. People who are better at math are more likely to have taken more math courses and more advanced math courses. And those courses may teach them something about logic and teach them in particular to evaluate arguments like these based on their logical form and not relying on knowledge or intuitions. And so that kind of a practice effect might also cause high math skilled individuals to rely less on knowledge and more on form. So Matthew, Laura, and I have recently been investigating this question. Actually, they started investigating it before I came, and we've continued that line of research together. And the perspective that we're using in this line of work is to investigate what we call belief effects. So I have to kind of give some more theoretical background here. I apologize for that, to explain what I mean by belief effects here. So let's suppose that there's some differences between conditionals in terms of how believable a conditional statement is, that some of these conditionals are more believable than others. If that's so, we would expect that the two valid inference forms, modus ponens and modus tollens, should be endorsed at higher rates if they involve believable conditionals compared to less believable conditionals. And to see why that's so, let's just go through the reasoning. I think it will be obvious when you say it out loud. If P then Q is very believable, and I tell you if P then Q, P therefore Q, well, you'll say, yeah, if P then Q. That's what you said, right? So therefore, this seems very persuasive. On the other hand, if I say if P then Q, P therefore Q, and you're thinking, but I don't necessarily accept if P then Q. Well, then you also probably don't accept P therefore Q. That's really just a different way of saying the same thing. Now, modus tollens, it's again a little more complicated, but if you recall the counterfactual chain of reasoning that justifies modus tollens is the argument is if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, and you say, well, if P were true, Q would be true, but it's not. That if P were true, then Q would be true. That step also requires you to believe if P then Q. So modus tollens should also be endorsed more for conditionals that are believable. Now, what about the other two inference forms, invalid inferences, AC and DA? Well, it turns out if you think this through, these inference forms should not rely on the believability of the conditional, but rather on the believability of the converse. The converse of if P then Q is if Q then P. So looking at the first invalid inference form, affirmation of the consequent, if I argue if P then Q, Q therefore P, well, if you accept Q therefore P, that means you believe if Q then P. Those are, again, almost the same thing. And DA, the case for DA is really analogous to MT. If you walk through it, you'll see that there's a similar sort of counterfactual reasoning that depends on believing the converse. I'll just skip that part and hope that you will trust me. Converse believability rather than conditional believability is what should predict endorsement of these two inferences. Now, in the work that Matthew and Laura did before my arrival, they've kind of already shown the first of these to be the case. So I'm just going to show some data that replicate their effect. But the work we're doing together tests for the first time the second prediction that converse belief should have an effect on endorsement of AC and DA that is analogous to the effect of conditional believability on MP and MT. Before I show you the results, though, I know that was quite a bit of stuff, and I want to highlight its relevance to the broader question. We're talking about whether knowledge affects conditional reasoning. Belief is a type of knowledge. So your a priori belief that a conditional is true or not, or that its converse is true or not, that's based on your knowledge of the content and has nothing to do with logical form. So evidence for belief effects is evidence for knowledge effects. And the central question here is, do such effects indeed appear among high-skilled individuals in math, just as I have already shown that they do for ordinary individuals? All right, so to test that question, what we did recently is to create a stimulus set that contains conditionals for each possible combination of high and low conditional believability and converse believability. I'm showing here just 4 conditionals from our set, which actually consisted of 16 conditionals. As you can see, because we're now dealing with high math skilled individuals, these conditionals are much more advanced in terms of their mathematical content. But the basic idea of knowledge affecting reasoning is the same. Where does these ratings come from? Well, Matthew and Laura previously did a norming study in which they asked a similar group of individuals to compare conditionals in terms of their believability and in terms of the believability of their converses. And based on the set of comparison results across the whole sample, they derived rather a rating of conditional believability and of converse believability for each conditional. So the stimulus design for this study employs the ratings from that previous study to assign conditionals to these 4 categories. I hope that made sense. So just to highlight the key predictions that were tested are that modus ponens and modus tollens should be endorsed more for conditionals that have high rather than low believability. AC and DA should be endorsed more for conditionals that have high rather than low converse believability if knowledge affects reasoning in this high math ability sample, similar to the way it does in ordinary individuals. And here are the results. These are endorsement rates for the 4 inference forms. For MP and MT, I'm showing you a breakdown by high versus low conditional believability in blue and green. For AC and DA, I'm showing you the breakdown for high and low converse believability in blue and green. And in every case except modus ponens, which again is near ceiling, we see the predicted effect, which is that the inferences are endorsed more for the high than for the low believability cases. So that was what was predicted. And we have a kind of interesting secondary result here, but maybe in interest of time, I'm going to skip over it. If you are interested in it, you can ask me in the questions, but this relates to item level effects relating believability to inference endorsement. So I'll skip over that for now. I want to take a few minutes to conclude here and just sum up what I think are the big messages from this research. First, the findings, I think, provide further evidence that the way conditional statements are interpreted it's not uniform. There's not a single interpretation of conditionals, but instead the way they're interpreted varies across domains. And math seems to be indeed special or unique in this regard, in that conditionals in math elicit interpretations in terms of certainty rather than probability, in contrast to what's observed elsewhere. Secondly, conditional reasoning in math, although it elicits interpretations of conditional statements that are different from other domains, but the basic mechanisms of reasoning about conditional arguments seem to be very similar. That is, they are knowledge dependent, just as has been previously documented for other domains such as everyday content. And this knowledge dependence we find is not only the case for ordinary university students, it's even the case for individuals who are specialized in and very good at math. And I think this finding is very striking and important because if we expected to find reasoning based only on logical form, if we expected to find that anywhere, we would expect to find it in math. Lo and behold, it's not even true in math. So I think this puts really the final nail in the coffin of the idea that formal logic underlies human reasoning. It doesn't do so in math, and if it doesn't do it in math, it doesn't do it probably anywhere. Finally, I've highlighted a particular kind of knowledge that I believe plays an important role in conditional reasoning, which is example knowledge, defined as the ability to generate and categorize examples of logical possibilities. I found both using individual differences and experimental methods that this type of knowledge is both predictive of and has a causal impact on conditional reasoning performance, which suggests, I think, in a big picture that although we might distinguish between deductive and inductive reasoning at a conceptual level, we think of those as two different things, but it appears that they're not actually separate in terms of the psychological processes, because reasoning in terms of examples is what we would normally call inductive reasoning, but lo and behold, here it is being used for a deductive reasoning task. So this, there's also another implication of this emphasis on example knowledge, because note that example knowledge, it has to be domain specific, right? So your knowledge of examples is your knowledge of examples in a particular domain. And the fact that such knowledge is a contributor to deductive reasoning is telling us that deductive reasoning is not entirely a domain general skill, even though we often think of it that way. Instead, individual differences in logical reasoning are driven in part by knowledge of the particular domain that one is reasoning about. Okay, so I think I've come to the end of my time and of my talk. Thank you so much for your attention. I welcome your questions.